So today, Becky Winstead asked me, based, I think, hopefully upon interest of this group, to do a presentation on the intersection of child welfare and domestic violence. And it's really apropos, obviously, this month during Domestic Violence Awareness Month. So we have a lot to cover in our hour together. But a brief overview is that we'll talk about sort of what the aspiration of child welfare should be. We'll talk about social science research at the intersection of child welfare and domestic violence. We'll highlight the challenges that both survivors and child welfare workers face when they're working with families experiencing domestic violence. And then we'll talk about best practices, ways to enhance safety, ways to buffer risk, and ways to collaborate. So at the end, I hope that you'll take away an understanding of this inextricable link between the safety and healing of adult and child survivors together. I hope you'll be able to envision a response that meets those needs and also gain concrete strategies to implement the best practices that we'll be talking about today. As we go, if you have questions, feel free to put them in the chat. Kim is going to monitor the chat. If the questions are really relevant to what we're focused on sort of in that part of the presentation, I'm happy to take questions there. If you have a question that maybe seems connected but less related to the actual content that we're discussing in the moment, maybe hold off to the end. And I'm happy to stay on a little bit longer too if I need to answer any questions that might have gone unaddressed. So just to do a little bit of level setting before we get started, I use some terms very intentionally throughout the presentation in reference to the adult survivor of domestic violence. I refer to that person as the adult survivor. This person is also sometimes called the non-offending parent. I will use she, her pronouns to describe the adult survivor, but the disclaimer is that I very much recognize that adult survivors can be a variety of different identities, but for the ease of this presentation, I will be using she, her pronouns. Also, I'll refer to the children who are in homes where there's domestic violence as a child survivor. And then it's a mouthful, but I refer to the parent who's perpetrating domestic violence as the parent using violence and coercive control. This is the acronym. I typically will not say PUVCC, but if you see that in my notes, you will know what it's referring to. So there are some realities about child welfare that are not unique to Illinois at all. These are actually unique. These are sort of challenges across the country in every single child welfare system. But I think it's important to sort of identify some of the both historical and contemporaneous challenges that are playing out in the child welfare system as we get started. And that is that most families involved in the child welfare system are living in poverty. There's racial disproportionality and disparity across the country, and it's also present in the northern region in Rockford also. And disproportionality is defined as the percentage of Black children in the child welfare system is greater than their proportion in the general population. And disparity refers to the fact that at critical decision points, the outcomes for Black children are worse than the outcomes for other races of children. And again, this is present in Illinois, but also across the country. Domestic violence is prevalent in 30 to 60% of all child welfare caseloads across the country. That's a quite a range, we know, and it's also likely underreported. So domestic violence is very prevalent in child welfare caseloads. And despite that prevalence, oftentimes they are the most challenging cases. And that's from the words of child welfare workers themselves, that domestic violence cases are really, really challenging. Also, across the country, the vast majority of cases that are coming into child welfare agencies are based upon neglect allegations. Yet the main tool of intervention that most child welfare agencies have at their disposal is removal and separation. So if you think about sort of that as the intervention for families that are struggling with domestic violence, substance abuse, mental illness, all experiencing poverty. We really want to think about how can we better meet the needs of families. And again, these layers of challenges that I just described have been present in the system since it started in the late 1800s and have continued through today, both in Illinois and across the country. So despite that reality that I just shared with you, I do want to present a theory of change that hopefully sort of confronts those challenges and transforms the responses into something different. And so the theory of change that I'm presenting to you and that we'll return to at the end also is that child welfare interventions will enhance rather than weaken a family's safety, stability, well-being, and healing when they are strength-based, trauma-informed, family-centered, and equity-focused. And I sort of unpack what all of those terms mean on the slide. But this is a theory of change that would lead to sort of transformation in responses. And hopefully you'll see that the best practices that I outlined for you and give you strategies for implementing are very consistent with this theory of change. So this really is that aspiration. We want to ensure that child welfare interventions are pathways to healing. So in that theory of change, you heard safety, stability, well-being, and healing. And I really hold healing as really the aspiration because safety, stability, and well-being are all critical components to being able to heal. And so one of the things that is really, to me, the aspiration of child welfare interventions is to build these protective factors as pathways to healing. And every single person that's on this call has the ability to help do this in their interaction with families. It's not that one person or one system is going to do it all, but that we all play a really critical role in creating these pathways to healing for children and their families. And the reason why these protective factors are important are because they're a person's mindset and view of themselves in the world. They're their roots and foundation. They're the way of overcoming obstacles. They're the way of being hopeful towards the future, of breaking cycles, and for healing. And so really, when we say we have this opportunity to intervene with families in times of need through the child welfare lens, that aspiration of what we are aiming to do is build protective factors as pathways to healing. So to ground us in sort of now, who are we actually talking about? Who are these families that deserve this intervention that has this aspiration? I want to ground us in this quote, and these are the words of a child who was living in a home where there was domestic violence. These were her reflections as an adult. Would anyone like to volunteer to read this? And if so, just you would unmute yourself and go ahead.
I always knew she stayed for us. She endured the pain and hell to provide for my sister and me. She feared we would end up like her, stuck, dependent. I cannot comprehend how the justice system can charge a battered mother with failure to protect and label her a bad mother. They say a good mother is one who forgets about her needs and desires and puts everyone before herself. Is that not what a battered mother does when she throws herself in the midst of a violent blow or distracts the batterer's attention by causing a divergence? Or when she lives 20 years in a loveless marriage so the children grow up with a male figure in the house? Or when she's raped just to have health insurance to care for a sick child? These all seem extremely selfless to me.
Thank you very much for reading that. So in these words, you are hearing the experiences of the families that we are talking about today. And in those words, you also can hear sort of exactly what social science has established as the critical impacts on both a child's experience of domestic violence and their ability to heal. So in those words, you heard that there were a variety of different factors present, but the most important factor was that adult survivor in that child's life. And so what we know is that both the impact of domestic violence on a child and that child's ability to heal is impacted by a variety of factors, but the most important factor is that relationship with the adult survivor. So this tells us a lot of things. This snapshot is really what so much of the intervention of best practice that has been created at this intersection is based on. And that is the notion that the needs of the adult and child survivors of safety and healing are inextricably linked. So if we can help enhance safety for the adult survivor, that will enhance safety for the child. And we know how critical the adult survivor is in being a source of healing for their children. We also know that any harms that children may have experienced by being exposed to domestic violence are significantly mitigated in a short period of time by remaining with the adult survivor in safety and stability. So this one of the sort of basis for the best practice that has evolved at this intersection is the idea of translational research, that we take what we know and we translate it into practice. So you're going to see how the best practices that we're going to talk about are linked to all of these nuggets of incredibly important social science research that we have. That the quality of the relationship with the adult survivor and the child is critical, that they're a critical link to the child's healing, and that children can actually really start to heal relatively quickly if they're living in safety and stability. So these are the core elements that any child welfare intervention should focus on in order to reach that aspiration we previously talked about. So despite what we know about social science research, what it just told us, and despite what we heard in the words of that child who was describing living in a home where there was domestic violence, survivors oftentimes face a sort of a persisting cycle of victim blaming in many systems that they intersect with, and that includes the child welfare system. So oftentimes we see the cycle. We know that domestic violence is a cycle. So we can see how the cycle continues, but the view is domestic violence occurred. She engaged in domestic violence. A child was hurt. She didn't protect. She didn't leave. She could not control him. A child could have been hurt. She did not leave. Domestic violence occurred, and the cycle continues and continues. And so when we really talk about what is the sort of, where is this victim blaming coming from, it's really in the notions of this cycle. And child welfare has legitimate concerns about the safety of children living in homes where there is domestic violence. As we just saw, we know that domestic violence is a cycle, and we know that it escalates over time. Child welfare workers have a unique and very strong mandate to keep children safe. It is a burden that child welfare workers carry that none of us, or I would say those of us who are not in child welfare, we don't carry it in the same way. And so acknowledging how critically important that mandate is really helps us understand sort of why these concerns are so real and why certain responses may not seem like they're meeting the aspiration because they're taking safety into account sort of with any risk possibility. We know that exposure to domestic violence can cause a trauma, even if children are not being physically harmed. Yet children can be physically hurt. Children can be physically hurt if they're trying to intervene. They can be the direct target of a parent's abuse while there's also domestic violence. We also know that child welfare can be very concerned when they have previous involvement, especially around domestic violence, and they're called out to the house again. And there's always this notion of she didn't leave. The cycle continued and she didn't leave. And we'll talk about why that she didn't leave framework can be really challenging and can actually contribute to the cycle of victim blaming. But there's often this notion of, well, she just needed to leave. The adult survivors also have concerns that oftentimes fly in the face of how they're experiencing a child welfare intervention. So there's oftentimes this disconnect between the concerns of the child welfare worker and the concerns of the adult survivor. So the adult survivor, while she's feeling like her parenting is obviously being questioned by the fact that DCFS is now involved, She knew that the well-being of her children likely controlled whatever decisions she felt she could make. Oftentimes, remaining with an abusive partner for the reasons that that child described are very real. And so she's not disregarding her children's needs, but really placing her children's needs as the priority, yet it doesn't always look that way from the outside. That framework of why didn't she just leave or she should have just left really discounts the reality that leaving an abusive relationship is the most dangerous time. The likelihood of homicide increases exponentially, as well as child kidnappings. And so saying that she should have just left actually means that she would be putting her and her children in the most dangerous time that they've experienced so far. Oftentimes, other systems have not kept her and her children safe. Oftentimes, the involvement of child welfare is not the first experience that family has with systems. And if they're getting to the point of child welfare involvement, they're likely, I'm not saying that's guaranteed, but there likely have been other experiences with systems that have proven that they cannot help keep her children and her safe, or they might have tried, but it hasn't worked. So she already has a concern that child welfare won't keep her and her children safe. And on top of that, the child welfare intervention feels more punitive and controlling than other interventions. And the fact that there's always the risk of separation from her children oftentimes feels like it's replicating the dynamics of domestic violence. That she does not have control over the system and the system's response has control over her. And that all leads to a fear and a lack of trust in the child welfare system. So you can sort of see how these challenges between child welfare workers' perspective and the adult survivor's perspective can really be at odds. And so it oftentimes transpires are responses that are not meeting the needs of families and not meeting this aspiration. Sort of what we typically are seeing, and this is again not unique just to Illinois, but unique across the country, is that there's a misunderstanding of the roles of domestic violence. Sometimes the adult survivor who might have used resistance violence or self-defense violence may have actually been deemed to be the perpetrator of domestic violence. The adult survivor really has to respond to the domestic violence the moment that knock occurs on her door from child welfare. The domestic violence advocacy community, and I know many of you are part of that community on the call today, has a very different approach to say that the services are here when she's ready, and she might be ready multiple times with starts and stops, but will always be here. So the response of saying, domestic violence is happening, we know about it, you have to respond immediately in the way that we're telling you, is not consistent with how most domestic violence services are offered. Really, her worth as a parent is based on if she stayed or if she left. The most typical response is to require her to try to get an order of protection, which may be helpful in some cases. In some cases, it actually might put her family in more danger. And there are times where there's no basis for an order of protection either. There's always that risk of removal, placing the children in foster care, or even with the abusive parent's family. Many adult survivors end up being indicated for neglect, which really take away from her ability to provide safety and stability for her kids. If you think about that social science slide that we saw, how critical it is to remain with the adult survivor in safety and stability. If an adult survivor is not able to work in a field related to children, if that could have been her field, if it jeopardizes potential immigration relief, that all can sort of continue to destabilize the family. There's oftentimes missed opportunity to really provide the survivor with the supports and services that she needs. The systems often struggle to foster accountability with the person using violence and coercive control. And ultimately, if this is what the intervention looks like, oftentimes the adult survivor will be deterred from reaching out for help in the future. So when we think about that scary or punitive or harmful responses that don't feel supportive, that they can cause a freezing effect on future help-seeking behavior that really causes us to say, okay, let's think about doing this differently. So turning to best practice. So knowing that these are our challenges, knowing which social science is sort of guiding us to do, how do we translate that? So the idea is that we want to meet the needs of families experiencing domestic violence, and we can do that in 3 different ways. There are many other ways, but in the interest of an hour-long presentation, I wanted to focus really on these 3 ways. So we can help build safety through protective factors, and we'll talk about removal as a last resort, partnering with the adult survivor, and avoiding indicated findings. Well, another way to do that is through buffering risk, and that's really through meaningful engagement that fosters avenues of accountability and through collaborating. So one really important thing to keep in mind is that the first impression of the intervention is incredibly impactful for how the adult survivor is going to engage going forward. So we know that the first 24 to 48 hours of an intervention is sort of the amount of time that the survivor will use to determine if she can actually trust this intervention to help keep her and her kids safe, or if it could cause them harm. So likely her family's experience is what these images are on the left. There are likely many different nets of systemic intervention that her family has interacted with, and likely they haven't fully helped. And so now there's another systemic intervention, and she's assessing quickly whether or not this intervention is going to be a safety net or a net that catches her family. And those first 24 or 48 hours will be determinative, especially if best practice, like we're going to talk about, if she can trust that will happen. And there are 3 just really simple and critical things that words to say, sentences to say to an adult survivor, if they're genuine, to really help shape this first impression that will then impact the rest of the intervention. And that is saying, I believe you, this is not your fault, and you are not alone. And saying that with sincerity and saying, I'm these 3 things, and I want to talk to you about what your family is experiencing, what you need. I know this has been really hard. That is a starting point that can really help impact that first impression. And I don't say it in a way to then have a first impression and then be disingenuous going forward, but it's a way of really coming together in partnership with the adult survivor to say, let's figure out how we can help keep you and your children safe together. So a little bit about child welfare removals, because as you saw, we were talking about how removal really should be the last resort. And I think this is something that if we commit to that, it can really help shift our responses. So we know that knock on the door is laden with fear for the adult survivor when it happens. Likely the person using violence and coercive control has been threatening that her children will be taken away from her, telling her she's a bad mother, and there's always that risk of removal. So there is so much fear in that knock. Protective custody is in the hands of really only 3 professionals: law enforcement officers, physicians, and child welfare workers. So the general public knows how much power child welfare workers have, and that, especially in many communities, is very scary. The ground for removal is imminent risk of harm. Removal should not occur if imminent risk of harm is not present. We know that no matter what a child is experiencing at home, the removal itself is a trauma. Even if it is a necessary trauma, we have to acknowledge the removal itself is very traumatic for children. And we're going to hear about that in a second in a quote. This removal oftentimes opens the door to out-of-home placements. Obviously, the removal will trigger a juvenile court case if it's screened in. But assuming that that sort of gatekeeping opens up, what happens then is that the child is removed from their source of healing, like we saw as being critically important to stay with that adult survivor to heal. We know that there's actually an increased risk of abuse and neglect in foster care than when compared to staying at home, even when there's allegations of abuse or neglect. And the average length of foster care in Illinois is almost 3 years. We are while we have a lower rate of taking kids into care, kids remain in care in Illinois for one of the longest out of any states. And the prognosis for children who have been in foster care is not great. They have an increased risk of homelessness, being involved in the criminal legal system, um, teenage pregnancy, drug abuse. So the prognosis for children in care is not great. And we know that Black children are taken into care at higher rates than their general population, and the outcomes once that happens for them are worse and they compound over time. So when we think about removal, that this is the main tool that child welfare has, there are many risks associated with it, like are just described here. So when especially when there's domestic violence, thinking about removal as a last resort is really important. And you'll see that this is in the words of both a daughter and her mother reflecting on the experience of being removed from their home and from their mother based upon domestic violence. And I would love to have another volunteer. You guys are all hearing my voice quite a bit. So if anyone else would like to read, feel free to unmute yourself and go ahead to read the one on the left.
My brother and I were taken away from my mother and put in 4 different homes in a year. Sniffle. I feel angry, mad, because I was taken away for some reason I didn't understand. I didn't want to be there because I was not there with my mother, my family, my friends. Just didn't like it at all.
Thank you. Would anyone else like to read Charlene Nicholson's quote on the right?
Domestic violence affected my role as a mother. It makes you leery of everybody, distrusting of people because no one believes that it's not something you asked for. It's a stigma that comes along with it. They think you brought it upon yourself. The removal of kids was more traumatic to me because when they were taken from me, I could not be with them. I could not see them, cook for them. I could not do the things I was used to doing as a mother. They did not save the child. They destroyed both lives.
Thank you. So just a little aside, Charlene Nicholson, if her name sounds familiar to you, she was the named plaintiff in a class action lawsuit in New York City that ultimately prevented the Child Welfare Agency in New York City from removing children from homes where there was domestic violence. And so Charlene is an amazing advocate now. I'm in touch with her quite regularly. And for the past 20 years, she's been advocating for systems to change in the ways that we're talking about today. And so this was her experience and her daughter's experience. And her daughter, they're incredibly close with her daughter now. She's an adult. But this was her experience when she was removed from her mom and placed in foster care solely due to domestic violence. Okay, so in thinking about removal as a last resort, even if you believe, yes, removal should be the last resort, you might be wondering, okay, well, how do we do that? How do we ensure safety? Sorry, I'm just getting my slide for one. Okay, so one of the ways to help enhance safety, thinking about removal as being the last resort, how can we enhance safety for the adult and child survivors together? One of those strategies is to really start by focusing on the precautionary measures the adult survivor has taken. And the definition of precautionary measures is defined here. This definition is not in Illinois statute or in the administrative code, so that's a really important thing to mention. But precautionary measures is relevant to DCFS's allegation of neglect that applies to domestic violence. But this broader definition is not there. It's not defined yet. But really what precautionary measures are all the actions, strategies, steps, behaviors, plans that the adult survivor formulates or takes or attempts or executes to try to prevent or mitigate the risk of harm to her children. Precautionary measures do not actually have to be successful. It does not actually have to have mitigated the risk or prevented the risk. It's the attempt to do so. And they include both the steps that she has taken to meet her children's basic needs, as well as the steps she's taken to address the domestic violence. And so why precautionary measures are important is because it captures the creative and courageous steps that adult survivors do every single day to try to mitigate the risk of harm to their kids and keep themselves and their children safe. And so when we think about, okay, if removal is the last resort, what do we do next to help build upon safety? And focusing on precautionary measures is that starting point. So precautionary measures are relevant in two ways. They are relevant to the investigative finding. So as you know, DCFS has an extensive allegation system of abuse and neglect. There is no specific allegation in their allegation system that's called domestic violence. Rather, domestic violence is relevant in two different allegations. One is substantial risk of physical injury, which is an abuse allegation that's typically used for the person using violence and coercive control. And then we have allegation 60, which is environment injurious, and that's a neglect allegation that's often applied to the adult survivor. So while the definition of precautionary measures I just shared with you isn't in statute or an administrative code, this definition of environment injurious is. So we have a very strong rule in Illinois that says that the adult survivor is presumed to be not neglectful so long as she has exercised precautionary measures to prevent or mitigate that real, significant, imminent risk of moderate to severe harm to the child. So this is important if you think back to our aspiration and the social science diagram that I showed you, because we want to ensure the adult survivor can continue to provide stability for her children. And so an indicated finding is that it will oftentimes take away from that ability to provide stability for her kids. And so when we think about these precautionary measures, we're going to talk about how they're relevant to safety in a second, but they're also relevant to this investigative finding. And to break it down a little bit further, just so you understand in more detail, this presumption is in place, and there's a specific harm that the domestic violence has to have met. So there's a threshold that it has to be real, significant, and imminent. And then if that threshold has been met, did the adult survivor take precautionary measures? And if so, then she's not neglectful. So there wouldn't be an indicated finding against her. We should be very proud in Illinois because we have one of the strongest rules in the country. So this is one of the strongest rules across the country that says that we're going to start from a place where the adult survivor is presumed to be neglectful. Think about that knock on the door and that first impression that we've discussed, and those 3 words of, I believe you, this is not your fault, and you're not alone. Then how thinking about precautionary measures and talking about it with this presumption, how it can really shift the dynamics and what will proceed from there. So here's a list of examples of precautionary measures. They're not defined in Illinois rules, but as I said, there's category of basic needs, school, education needs, medical needs, housing, clothes, all of those basic needs, food, and then the ones that are domestic violence specific. So those could be developing a safety plan with the child, defending themselves, seeking guidance from a religious counselor, calling the police, getting an order of protection, trying to end the relationship. All of those things are precautionary measures, as well as the concrete ways that the adult survivor tried to protect the child. And again, sometimes these precautionary measures don't appear precautionary. They appear, they need context. And I'm happy to share these slides, and Becky and Nikki have the slides, and Kim, I can get them to Kim also. So don't feel like you have to write all these down. But these really are the panoply, and the list is endless. There are creative and courageous things that adult survivors do every single day along these lines to keep her children safe. I wanted to share this resource with you. It's a toolkit that I wrote a handful of years ago that has worksheets at the end to really help bring these precautionary measures to the surface. Sometimes they're not self-evident to a survivor. They have just been her means of survival. They don't seem significant. The abuser has been telling her over and over she's a terrible mother, so she doesn't even believe the things that she's been doing have been valuable at all. And so these questions really help bring the information to the surface because, one, it's a way of building rapport with her. Two, it's a way of really getting the information necessary to avoid unnecessary indicated findings. And as you're going to see, it's a way of helping to build interventions around enhancing safety. So the bottom line of what Environment Injurious is aiming to accomplish is that as a threshold, being a victim of domestic violence does not make the adult survivor neglectful. We're trying to move away from this leaving or staying as the only framework for basing neglect on. We are trying to shift mindsets and biases, take into account the lived experience of adult survivors and their children. Hopefully, when you think about precautionary measures and you think about that first quote we read about the child who's reflecting on her experience, there were so many precautionary measures that popped out in that quote. We don't want survivors to have to minimize the domestic violence they've experienced at child welfare just to avoid an indicated finding or getting her children removed. We want to be in a place where an adult survivor can say, yeah, it's been really, really hard. I've been worried that he could kill both of us, me and my children. These are the things that I have tried to do. And let's try to enhance those so we can actually live in safety. So many adult survivors feel like they cannot be forthcoming about the abuse because of the fear of the punitive responses and separation. We want to assign responsibility where it's appropriate to do so. And we want to avoid these freezing effects of reaching out for help and having the help backfire. Because from a public policy perspective, we want to ensure that people are reaching out for help when they need it. So I told you there was a second way and a second reason why these precautionary measures are important. So they're first important, as I described, to really get a sense of whether or not the adult survivor should be indicated for neglect or not, but they also are critical building blocks to helping partner with the adult survivor to enhance safety. So these precautionary measures, all the things the adult survivor has tried to do and maybe has been successful in doing, are the opportunities to build upon them and support them. So the way this translates into practice is that we start by really sincerely saying with the adult survivor, I am partnering with you in doing this. This is the notion that the domestic violence community really adheres to, and that is that the survivor is the expert in her own experience. She knows best, and but she also can benefit from the support and partnering to bring other support to the table. So building trust by avoiding blame, we've already talked about that. Really asking her, what are her needs for safety for her and her children? What has she tried before? And then brainstorming ideas for different strategies or to enhance what she's already done. Always considering what are those risks to safety steps. So if she says, no, I can't get an order of protection, rather than saying, oh, mom must be choosing her abuser over her children, or she's not willing to take any steps to protect them, to say, okay, I hear you. Can you explain to me why? Oh, I see. You've tried before. And after that happened, he tried to kidnap your kids. I understand why that you think this could put you in more danger. Let's think about some other strategies that we could try now. Really bringing to the table concrete supports and uniquely tailored services. So not a boilerplate case plan or service plan that's given to everybody, but really thinking about what does she actually need? Does she actually need to get her driver's license so she can now drive her kids and get her kids to school and get herself to a job? Does she need help with her resume? Does she need help taking English classes so she can speak the language more fluently? Does she need childcare assistance, transportation, housing? Does she need financial assistance? We know how beneficial financial assistance can be. So really identifying what her needs are and bringing those supports to the table. Really avoiding mandates. Any mandate will have unintended consequences. both in terms of risks of that mandate that the person working with the family might not realize, but it also will really start eroding trust. An expectation that the abuse will continue even after a separation or a separation attempt. I said earlier that separation is the most dangerous time for a survivor and her kids. So just because she's got an order of protection and gone to a domestic violence shelter does not mean the abuse is going to end. It could actually escalate, and it is not her fault if the abuser does that. It just is a recognition of how severe the situation is and how much additional support is needed based upon her own guidance. And then really recognizing that there are barriers to engaging in services and supports. It's oftentimes has ups and downs, and then continue to strategize around those barriers in partnership with her, not giving up on her and her children, not thinking that a failure to go to a parenting class or a domestic violence class is a reflection that she doesn't care, but really to understand why wasn't she able to make it? Is she struggling with transportation? Is she struggling with depression? Is she struggling to manage all of the things that she needs to do and get her kids to school and hold down a job? So really, when we talk about partnership with the adult survivor around safety, that's really what we're talking about. And if that imminent risk of harm threshold has been met, where the children are really in imminent risk of harm, such that removal could occur, really considering a child welfare safety plan in place of that protective custody that's constructed and made with her, not imposed upon her, but really co-created with her. So turning now, so we just discussed different ways of building those protective factors, both in terms of building trust, identifying precautionary measures as ways of avoiding inappropriate indicated findings that can destabilize a family, and also thinking about how that partnership around safety is so important. The other category to talk about is how we can buffer risk. And buffering risk really comes through interaction with the parent using violence and coercive control. And I really wanted to make a distinction between responsibility and accountability, and the child welfare system has a role to play in both. When we think about someone who is causing harm to other people, there's both holding them responsible and creating avenues of accountability. When we talk about responsibility, it is an external imposition of consequences. It's punishment, it's limitations on liberty. It is a consequence for causing harm, for bad behavior. The equivalent in child welfare would be to indicate a parent using violence and coercive control for an allegation of abuse, allegation 10. That would be holding them responsible for the harm they've created. But if we really talk about long-term change, we know that responsibility oftentimes does not create long-term change. It might serve an important purpose, but it won't create necessarily the long-term change, because long-term change comes through the process of becoming accountable. That is an internal process based upon a motivation to change. And both, as I said, are important. In order to foster avenues of accountability for the parent using violence and coercive control, the child welfare system and any other system that you all are working in can lean on a couple different tactics. And again, I use this language very intentionally when I say foster avenues of accountability. You won't ever hear me say hold someone accountable. You can hold someone responsible, but you're not holding someone accountable. Rather, you are helping to foster avenues of accountability. That comes through meaningful engagement with that person, seeing them as a person, not just the choices they're making that harm others. Oftentimes, child welfare struggles to engage with that parent using violence and coercive control. They're not necessarily as motivated to be engaged. It can be kind of uncomfortable and scary sometimes. So really meaningfully engage is important. Oftentimes connecting around values of fatherhood and being a good father are the way of connecting in that meaningful way in a way that can help motivate someone to want to change. There are the formal program for parents who use violence and coercive control, or for anybody, our partner abuse intervention programs. I know there are some people on the call today who help lead those programs and work in those programs. Also, finding sources in someone's culture or identity that can be sources of motivation to change are really important. And then thinking beyond our typical responses and thinking about what other resources are in the community that could help create avenues of accountability. I think that there are so many untapped ideas in this area that we want to continue to motivate our each other in systems to help innovate and create. And once a person says, okay, I'm willing to engage in this process of becoming accountable, even if it starts off because they're forced to go, the process of becoming accountable really entails healing from trauma, learning new behaviors, and repairing harm. And that is the long-term process of change. Again, as I said, child welfare has a role to play, as we all do, in fostering these avenues of accountability and also in holding people responsible, understanding the distinction. And these two things, especially fostering these avenues of accountability, will help buffer risk. We can never say that our intervention is going to 100% keep someone safe, or it's going to 100% eliminate risk. That is not the realm we are dealing with when we're talking about domestic violence. But we can enhance safety and buffer risk, and if we're doing both, the likelihood of enhanced safety and ultimately that aspiration of healing will be much more likely. So if you recall on the slide that was discussing sort of our 3 areas of best practice, the last one I want to discuss with you is collaboration. And we're going to talk about collaboration at a systemic level, because we adhere to the idea that if we can mirror collaboration at the systemic level, then it's more likely that that will happen in partnership with families in the actual casework. So I'm excited to share or talk to you about a program that's been in existence since 2019 in Illinois and in Rockford since 2019, called the Domestic Violence Co-Location Program. The DVCLP, which is what I will refer to it as because it's a mouthful, is an innovative program that places a domestic violence advocate who's employed by a local partner domestic violence agency in DCFS offices. And the goal of this partnership is to really help build the systemic capacity of child welfare workers, investigators, intact and permanency workers to more effectively respond to families experiencing domestic violence, which we would say is to implement that theory of change, to really aspire for safety, stability, well-being, and healing to meet their needs. Another goal is to support all members of the family during the DCFS intervention. So that's the adult survivors, the child survivors, and the parent using violence and coercive control, and to be a link for the family to services and concrete supports. So we really like to think about the DVCLAs, who are the co-located advocates, wearing 2 hats to sort of have 2 clients. The child welfare workers are their clients and building that systemic capacity, and all members of the family are their clients in really helping them navigate the child welfare intervention and connect to the services that they need and this concrete supports. This program has been funded in a variety of ways. It's been funded both when it started and currently through 2 different federal grants. It's been supported extensively through private philanthropy and through Illinois DHS funding. So the DVCLP exists in 6 locations across the state, in Waukegan, in Rockford, 2 locations in Chicago, Springfield, and Belleville. And I have Winnebago County highlighted because Rockford has been a part of the partnership since the beginning. Remedies Renewing Lives is the partner domestic violence agency that is partnered with the Rockford DCFS office. We are working on finalizing our 2024 data report. I have linked our 2023 data report here so you can learn more about the DVCLP if you're interested. But just a few highlights. In 2024, the program served nearly 500 families, nearly 1,400 individuals, and over 870 children. It connected adult survivors and their children with concrete supports, and did that specifically for 59 parents who used violence and coercive control. The majority of DCFS workers demonstrated an increased understanding about domestic violence through this partnership. 61% of the children remained with the adult survivor in cases that the DVCLAs know of, and that's a 7% increase from the year before. And the program also saved the state millions of dollars in safely preventing children from entering foster care. Ultimately, this partnership and this collaboration really is a safe way to prevent children from unnecessarily entering long-term care. And so the cost of the program is very minimal when compared to the millions of dollars that are saved in preventing children from entering foster care with the high foster care rates and the long length of time that children remain in foster care in Illinois. So this program has a vision for statewide expansion. The goal is that there will be a co-located domestic violence advocate in every single DCFS office across the state, and that we'll be able to partner with DCFS as early as we can, even at the hotline level. And so we are hoping the program will expand, but we are thrilled that it's been in Rockford for as long as it has been. So I want to end with just sort of bringing this all together in thinking about, we started with what our aspiration looks like on paper. We talked about some of the best practice responses based upon social science research. We talked about challenges, and we talked about those strategies for really implementing best practice by enhancing safety through partnership, precautionary measures, by buffering risk through meaningful engagement and fostering evidence of accountability, and through collaboration, knowing that not one system is equipped to respond to families alone, and it really requires a multi collaboration response. So when we think about then that what this theory of change can look like, what this aspiration can be, I really welcome you to think about this image here. And if you think about each one of these squares representing sort of a family in their community, and what you'll see from these squares and the circles within them is that these families, or if these symbolize families, they're strong and vibrant and colorful and dynamic and unique. And that's reality of every family. And you'll see the circles. If the family's in the middle, you'll see all these circles around the family. And those are all the protective factors that we discussed today. And we know that the protective factors are the closest to the family, are the most impactful and the most significant. But all of these protective factors are important, and we all have a responsibility and a role to play in helping to build these protective factors for families experiencing domestic violence in the child welfare system. So to me, this is sort of an artistic, symbolic representation of what our aspiration can look like in practice. And when we do that, then we will start breaking cycles, because we know that healing is critical to the cycles of abuse that oftentimes replicate if healing does not occur. And the last thing we want to do as a system is create more trauma and more compounded trauma that impedes healing and now creates more trauma for people to heal from and children to heal from. So we really want to see ourselves as those cycle breakers, and that aspiration is the way to do it. And so I will end, just in the interest of time, even though I really appreciate all of you who read. I'll just end with this one quote, which also just grounds us in the perspectives that we've shared today. And that is that remaining with it better is not about being masochistic or codependent. It is about not knowing whom it is safe to disclose the abuse, not knowing what can be done if the shelter is full, not knowing what to do if the judge does not believe me, not knowing what to do if the shelter makes me quit my job so the better does not follow me back, not knowing what to do if the prosecutor does not treat my case seriously, not knowing what to do if I have no job skills and cannot pay the rent without him, not knowing what to do if he says he will kill me and my children if I leave him, not knowing what to do if he says he will find me wherever I go, not knowing what the judge will give him custody of the children, and not knowing how I will stay alive in the process of fleeing. So our role together is to help sort of change that not knowing to supporting the adult survivor and her children in order to navigate these very complex and very risky situations that they're in ways that help enhance their safety and ultimately their healing. So I'll leave you just with this last slide. If you are interested in learning more, finding inspiration, or taking action, there are a few things on this slide. A book that I wrote that was published by the American Bar Association on this very topic, an excellent TED Talk, the Green Book, which is the best practice guide at this intersection, and then a piece of legislation that we were able to get across the finish line in the House last year, but not the Senate. We'll be trying again this next year. So sorry for a little bit of a rush at the end. I am more than happy to stay on if there are any questions, but I really thank you for your time.